we've talked over the years about, it seemed like for the longest time the theme was, Democrats were improving their status in Virginia, Republicans were retreating a bit. You were always hesitant, if I recall. People wanted to call, Virginia a increasingly blue state. I remember you would use purple or even periwinkle pink or different colors to describe it a little bit. And now things are heading back in the other direction. Just maybe your first insights into what you thought after last week's numbers, and especially specific to Virginia, as to the results in those congressional elections.
Well, I think it's important to remember that when you're thinking about an electorate, there are basically two moving parts. One moving part is the intensity of the partisans, so the intensity of the Democrats and the Republicans, and the other moving part is the moderate middle voter. And so in any election cycle, the winner and the loser is going to be determined by who's benefiting from how those moving parts are moving. And in a couple of election cycles in Virginia, at the statewide level, the moderate middle has moved to the left and really supported Democratic moderate candidates like Mark Warner and Tim Kaine in the state Senate. And then in the last gubernatorial election, that moderate sort of moved back to the right. I don't think the intensity of the Democrats and the Republicans moved a lot. I think you still had the same percentage of Democrats and Republican identifiers in Virginia. The Republicans were a little bit more energized and excited. The Democrats were a little bit more a couple of years ago. So I think, the fundamentals of Virginia, I don't think have changed. I think for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years maybe, Virginia's been an increasingly competitive state where both parties battled it out over ideas and such. But I think the part of that moving part that's moved back and forth has been that moderate middle, and it just so happens in Virginia in the last 2 or 3 years, they've swung pretty wildly. First they swung to the left and elected Democrats, and then they swung to the right and elected Bob McDonnell, and then they stayed to the right and elected Republicans in these congressional seats. And so that's why I always called Virginia purple instead of blue or red, because when a third of your population isn't Democratic or Republican, and they wander back and forth along that ideological spectrum, I mean, they determine who's going to win office and who's going to lose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What's your early look at the 2011 state races? The state Senate and House delegates are all up in this next cycle. The Democrats have sort of what the Democrats at the national level had in terms of having to defend a majority. They have a smaller majority to defend, but I guess the pressure would be on their side going into this election cycle, it would seem, with the state Senate being in their hands right now.
Well, yeah, we're going to have a redistricting session between now and then, and given that the Senate is controlled by Democrats and the House by Republicans, and the governor's a Republican, I would imagine that stasis will rule rather than anything else, that everything will stay kind of like it is. The House will remain Republican, the Senate will remain Democratic. You might get some squabbling around the edges about, whether this precinct is moved out of this district into that district, but I don't imagine big changes happening. Because no party is going to be able to just dictate redistricting, and if something doesn't get through the Senate, then the governor can't sign something, which means the Department of Justice will end up, if they have to, drawing lines for us. So I imagine rather than letting the Department of Justice draw lines, that the Democrats and Republicans are going to make a deal. This is what I've understood. The Democrats, you take care of the Senate. Republicans, you take care of the House. We'll agree whatever the other chamber wants to do with itself. We won't oppose that. The governor will sign whatever it is in the law. So I imagine a lot more of the same as opposed to any big change.
That would make sense. And then it occurs to me, it doesn't seem like it's been that long ago now, but the 2007 cycle when the state Senate seats were up, we talked a good bit about that cycle in terms of, here in my district, and now in some other districts across the state, we saw incumbent Republicans who, in some cases been in the state Senate for a long time, challenged by intra-party, more conservative candidates. I like to say they were Tea Party candidates before the Tea Party was cool. And I would expect maybe we'll see some of that again this time around, and that could have a factor into November of 2011, especially on that Senate side.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The Senate is where moderates, what moderates there are in Virginia anymore, hang out in the Senate. The extent to which the Tea Party crowd in Virginia has been energized by the elections, then it makes sense that if they're going to go after some moderate Republicans who don't toe the line as far as they're concerned, they'd go after Republicans in the Senate. The problem is, I don't think the Tea Party was as energized and as I don't think they played as much of a force in Virginia as they did in other states. I know they played a role in the 5th congressional district race that Tom Perriello lost re-election in, and they played a small role in the 2nd congressional district race, but they're not. The Tea Party of Virginia is nothing like the Tea Party of Nevada or some of the other states like Kentucky, for example. So I'm not sure how much intra-party competition you're going to have. But if you're going to have it, I think that's the place you're going to have it, is the moderate Republicans in the Senate.
Yeah, because our House of Delegates, the Republican caucus is already pretty conservative there, so I can't imagine seeing a lot of challenge there. Maybe a couple of people on the fringes, but there's not a lot of room for maneuvering there. Those guys are already pretty ideologically one way or the other. Democrats and Republicans there are on more to the extreme, I guess you can say, than the ones in the Senate would be.
Yeah.
So, one other thought to get from you on this, the Democratic Party of Virginia will be undergoing a leadership change with Dick Cranwell announcing that he's stepping down. I've seen Brian Moran's name out there as someone. It would seem like, even though Democrats had made for better part of that first decade of the 21st century some significant gains, in some respects they're back to where they started from. At least the numbers in the House of Delegates, they do control the state Senate, but the momentum right now on the Republican side. So it would seem like the next Democratic Party chair would have their work cut out for them, no matter who that ends up being.
Yeah, I think that's right. And remember, what the next Democratic Party does is going to be in relation to what the next Democratic Party chair does is going to be in relation to what the governor does in some ways. And yeah, if you just count seats, it looks like the Democrats are where they were 10 years ago. But I think it's worth noting that Bob McDonnell ran successfully as a Republican give and throw candidate, as a business-oriented, no-nonsense kind of, I'm going to work in the economy, I'm not going to deal with social issues kind of candidate. And I think he found himself over there running as not as an ideological Republican, but as a business-oriented Republican, in part because of the successes of the Democratic Party and because of the successes of Mark Warner and Tim Kaine running in the middle, avoiding talk of social issues. Voters like that. They rewarded the Democrats for that twice. The Republicans ran some pretty ideological candidates a couple of times, and both at the gubernatorial level and then the U.S. Senate race between Mark Warner and Jim Gilmore, and they lost pretty miserably, and they realized, we're going to have to run in the middle like the Democrats have been doing if we want to win. So while the numbers may make Democrats look like they are where they were 10 years ago, I think to some extent the policy ground on which candidates compete has shifted, or the candidates have shifted in the context of that policy ground because of the successes of Democrats over the last 10 years.
That's a great point, and I bring that up whenever I discuss the future of Ken Cuccinelli, whatever that might be, whether 2013 carries out for him running again for Attorney General, if he might make a bid, even though there was supposedly that gentleman's agreement between Bob McDonnell and Bill Bolling for Bolling to be able to run next time. Ken Cuccinelli probably wasn't part of that agreement. Cuccinelli would definitely deviate from that model that I think really both McDonnell and Bolling fit into.
Right. I think that's right. So, the question is, does Ken Cuccinelli carve out a place where he can mount a successful campaign not in a Republican primary? He's the darling of the Republican base right now.
Uh-huh.
But how big is that Republican base in the context of the overall electorate? And, I think that's the big question. I'm not convinced that the base of the Republican Party is a significant enough proportion of the overall Virginia electorate for Cuccinelli to ride that to a victory again. I think he could do it last time for a couple of reasons. A weak Democratic candidate, and although Cuccinelli was a known factor in where he was from, he wasn't a known factor statewide. And I think you get a lot of people who were surprised at the way he's been, the way he's generaled as the Attorney General. And I think he would have to defend that more if he were to run for re-election or run for another statewide office. I think he'd be in a position of defending a lot of what he did, as opposed to not really having to defend what people didn't know about. Even though everybody who paid attention to politics knew what he was like, the vast majority of people simply compared him to his opponent and said his opponent's weak, and so we're going to go with him.
I think there was a lot of, well, we're voting for Bob McDonnell, let's just go straight ticket. There's not a lot of attention paid to down ticket races in general, especially the further down you go. But I would agree that the next time around, I'd be surprised if that was the case again, that he would skirt through without a lot of attention from the media and from voters as well. Yeah.
Yeah, as evidence of that straight ticket voting, a lot of people who pay attention to politics said they expected, Bob McDonnell to win, Bill Bowling to win, and Cuccinelli to either lose closely or squeak by very closely. And in fact, he won very handily. And it suggested there was a lot of straight ticket voting, and it suggested voters were even less impressed with Steve Shannon than we might have thought that they would have been. So, but I think there was a lot of straight ticket voting, much more of it than we would have given voters credit for having done before the election.